between home value. We think about the relationship between home values on the one hand and race on the other. And if you just kind of plot out on a scatter plot, percent white versus home value in the US, what you see is a fairly positive correlation. That is just to say, the whiter a neighborhood is, or the whiter a census tract is in the US, the higher the home value. And I think the positive relationship, this is just a statistical note here, the positive relationship would be even stronger if it weren't for the US Census top coding at $2 million as the maximum, or basically the census category is 2 million or above. So we see the influence of top coding there. And then when we add on to this scatter plot, percent African-American, we see, again, a strong negative correlation between median home values and percent African-American. Basically, this means that the more a neighborhood or more a census tract is populated by African-American families and communities, the less the median home value will be in that area. This is this effect in the state of Virginia can be seen fairly strongly, statistically with high degree of statistical significance. This comparison between white home values and white population and positive home values and African-American population and negative home values. And if you zoom in to where I work in Hampton Roads, Virginia, again, we can see this exact same relationship and even stronger statistical significance. And so what are we kind of looking at here? I guess before we zoom out and kind of interpret some of this, it's worth saying that even when you adjust for median household income, home values in Hampton Roads drop, or home values in Hampton Roads neighborhoods drop by $700 for every percentage increase of a neighborhood's African-American population. So this is to say, even like if we're looking at neighborhoods with median household incomes being the same, Black neighborhoods are less valuable in terms of their housing stock. I'm a geographer. I like to kind of think through these problems spatially in cartographic form. And so when you look at this on a map at the national scale, this data essentially translates into, spatially, it translates into really high degrees of racial segregation in the US. In fact, a recent report found that amongst the 200 or so largest metro areas in the US, basically most large and medium-sized cities in the US, only 2 of them are categorized as integrated, and for nearly all of them, levels of racial segregation today is higher than it was 30 years ago. So residential racial segregation is in fact increasing over time. And what this looks like at the city scale, you take New York, for example, what I think of as a pretty diverse, multicultural, multiracial city. But when you look at where people live within the city, you see that at the end of the day, like the literal end of the day, when folks go to their homes and apartments, those homes and apartments are mostly populated, are mostly located in neighborhoods and on blocks that are populated by people of the same race and ethnicity. You see this reproduced in Chicago, the statistically speaking, one of the most segregated cities in the US. You see this in Detroit, with kind of the infamous 8-mile road that divides the majority Black city of Detroit from the majority white suburban Macomb County to the north. And if we zoom into Hampton Roads, we see this once again in the Hampton Roads region. Of course, the geography, the specifics of the geography is different because of the water, because of the military presence, all of this. But what we do see is that most neighborhoods in Hampton Roads are either 70% or more white or 70% or more African-American. There's not a lot of neighborhoods that are truly racially integrated. And so the animating questions that drive my research is, on the one hand, where did this come from? This kind of the historical question. And spoiler alert, this was not an accident. All right. So where did this come from? How did these landscapes of racial segregation come about? The second question is the present day question. What are the ongoing impacts in the present? If that's our history, where they came from, what are the impacts in the present? And then I think kind of the question for all of us to consider today is where do we go from here? What can we do about this? So let me like I'm going to mostly try to answer the first two questions and then prompt you all in this kind of third question that I have here. I'm going to pepper you all with some questions to kind of leave today thinking about how this work kind of might be implicated in some of the work you all are doing. Let me first recognize my most recent research team, Jakira, Dominique, and Asia. They have been absolutely instrumental in a lot of the research that I'm going to present today. I'll specifically try to highlight their contributions when it comes up. They have all moved on to bigger and better things, but I didn't want to continue without recognizing their contributions. So let's get down to it. Where did this come from? Where did these landscapes of racial segregation come from? Well, first of all, it wasn't an accident. There was a whole host of federal housing policies across much of the 20th century. And those federal housing policies that were intentionally, overtly discriminatory essentially gave cover to states, localities, businesses, and even individuals to also implement discriminatory policies and practices at all different spatial and governmental levels. So let me walk through. I don't have nearly enough time to go through all the different policies and practices that segregated American cities, but I do want to highlight a couple. We've heard in the news over the last couple of years a lot about redlining. And so let me just a real quick overview of what redlining is. This is a policy from the Great Depression from the 1930s, where the federal government, through the predecessor to the FHA, it's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. The federal government went and they rated neighborhood after neighborhood, city after city, for the neighborhood's worthiness for housing assistance during the Great Depression. So the best neighborhoods were given the highest rankings, green and blue on the map, and quote unquote, the hazardous neighborhoods that weren't deserving of federal housing assistance during the Depression, were given the fourth grade, the lowest grade, colored red on the map. And that's where this idea of redlining comes from. And it's actually, from a historical perspective, there's just a tremendous amount of historical data here, archival data. These have all been digitized from the National Archives. What you can see is that every single neighborhood, in the case of Hampton Roads, this one map has 96 different neighborhoods, and each one of them has a data sheet. And on that data sheet, there's extensive quantitative information, including the class and occupation, the number of foreign families, their nationalities, the percent African-American, the types of building, the soundness of construction, and then also descriptions of the characteristics, kind of in-depth qualitative descriptions of the characteristics of each neighborhood. And one of my students, the one who's Dominique, the one who's now in law school, she did pretty extensive qualitative discourse analysis of this to find that the neighborhoods that got the top ranking were kind of celebrated for having paved roads and streetlights and green spaces and all kinds of environmental amenities, whereas redlined neighborhoods were often flagged for having mud or rut-filled roads or lacking of streetlights, or in many, many cases, they were flagged as being in close proximity to all kinds of different environmental hazards, whether that was industrial rail lines or factories or different types of air and water pollution, especially. But at the end of the day, you have all this information, and then when you just look at it by race, when you break down this map of Hampton Roads by race, of the A-rated neighborhoods, all of them were 100% white. Of the B-rated neighborhoods, all of them were 100% white, except for one neighborhood was seen to be 25% Jewish. Of the C neighborhoods, all were 100% white, except for two. This neighborhood had a 5% African-American population. This neighborhood, Phoebus, for those who are familiar with this area, Phoebus was rated to have a 30% African-American population. And of the neighborhoods that were redlined, nearly all of them were majority Black. In fact, there is not a single majority African-American neighborhood in all of Hampton Roads that escaped at the time that escaped redlining. And this is a practice that happened in nearly 250 cities all around the country. And so there's an interactive map actually out of the University of Richmond. They've mapped out every single one of these Depression era redlining maps, and you can explore there. I don't want to spend more time with that because this is kind of a visual starting point with that really stark redlining map in the case of Hampton Roads from 1940. But if we going the wrong direction. If we fast forward in time past World War II, pretty substantial changes to federal housing policy meant that most public housing built in the 1940s to the 1960s was built in formally redlined neighborhoods and was segregated Black. And so, and you can map this out in city after city if you just look at kind of an overlay of where public housing is compared to where neighborhoods were redlined. In the case of Hampton Roads, every single public housing project in all of this region is either in or immediately adjacent to a formerly redlined neighborhood. And at the same time, the U.S. during the kind of the baby boom period of 1946 to 1964, some of the fastest growing population years in this country's history, really. At the very same time that the U.S. government was building out segregated Black public housing in urban cores, they were building out what we now think of as like the quintessential American suburb. In these suburbs, this is Levittown on Long Island. It's about 19,000 homes, all developed by William Levitt. In fact, there's 7 different Levitt towns around the country, including one in Puerto Rico. But William Levitt wouldn't have had the funds to build 19,000 homes here, another 12,000 in Pennsylvania, another several thousand in Puerto Rico, and so on. Wouldn't have had the capital to do this without substantial backing from the federal government, from the FHA specifically. And the FHA required Levitt and Daley and other major suburban housing developers from this time they provided this funding on the basis that on the condition that these properties would all include racially restrictive covenants. And this is what you're seeing on your screen now is an example of a racially restrictive covenant actually from the city of Norfolk. This specific covenant this specific restriction is included in the deed of every single house in the Algonquin neighborhood in Norfolk, that the said property shall not be sold, leased, given, or devised to a person of African descent or to a corporation, the majority of whose stock is owned or controlled by persons of African descent. So if we look at redlining public housing policy, segregationist public housing policy, and the existence of these racial covenants, these are 3 policies, intentionally discriminatory, intentionally racist policies emanating from the federal government through housing policies that had the impact of not only segregating, but also investing in white neighborhoods and white communities and disinvesting in Black neighborhoods and Black communities. And this also, like I said before, gave cover to lots of other people, state governments, city governments, urban planning departments, realtors, banks, and other lenders to also engage in discriminatory policies and practices. So if we look at some of these, we see the existence of exclusionary zoning has been used to effectively keep suburban areas white now for more than a century. We see large-scale discriminatory lending, both in the past and also continuing today into the present of discriminatory lending policies, what some people refer to as modern-day redlining. We see this in terms of racial steering from real estate agents and discrimination in real estate and also in rental markets. This was a study done a couple of years ago out on Long Island. We see this in terms of how the urban interstate highway system was constructed. This is a wonderful article by Deborah Archer in the Vanderbilt Law Review. It was just published a couple of years ago about the intentionality of building urban interstates specifically for the reason of disrupting Black and brown neighborhoods, African-American and Latino-owned commerce and commercial districts, and so on. If we look at this in the context of our urban interstate system here in Hampton Roads, I just looked at did a really simple kind of analysis and map here of 1970 census data, which is about the year when a lot of these most of these interstates went in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so if you map the where the interstates run over top of the population, the census geography from that period, what you see is that African-American populations were disproportionately impacted by the construction of urban interstates in this region, and just like in so many other regions. You see this over and over, all these different things, whether it's redlining or racial covenants or single family zoning or highway construction, these all kind of cumulatively constitute this century-long disinvestment in Black and brown communities. So this is that's if you take my urban geography course, we spend a lot more time going into a lot more detail of these policies. But at the end of the day, like, where did these landscapes of racial segregation come from? Well, that's where they came from, the intentionally discriminatory policies and practices, all the way from the federal government, all the way down to local banks and real estate agents and everyone in between. Part of this century-long process of disinvestment and devaluation of Black and brown properties all over the country. To shift gears a little bit, to look at what are the impacts in the present day, because sometimes you might be able to say, well, we passed the Fair Housing Act now more than 50 years ago. Johnson signed that in 1968. And I have heard people say, any kind of segregation today is either A, by choice, or B, by economics, not by race. And I want to kind of problematize that a little bit to show what some of the lasting impacts of these past intentionally discriminatory policies have been. So one thing, and some of you may have seen some version of this data or heard something about what's called the racial wealth gap. This is the gap, what you're seeing on your screen right now is the gap in incomes and median family incomes between the median white family and the median Black family. There's about a 35% gap in incomes, but that is nothing compared to the 90% gap between the wealth of the median white family and the wealth of the median Black family. Then again, just a kind of a quick, if it's been a while since you've taken a stats course, median is, we're not talking about averages here, we're just talking about the median, the family in the middle. Half of white families have more wealth, half of white families have less wealth. And this is right here, this $171,000 of wealth that is the median white family wealth. This is the result of the American investment over much of the 20th and into the 21st century in home ownership. But that opportunity for home ownership, the middle 50% in the US, the wealth that we have is mostly in the one single house that we own and live in. And that wealth accumulates over time. It accumulates generationally. And that right there is the result of America's investment in white home ownership and the 90% gap between median white family wealth and median Black family wealth. This is the result of the century-long project of disinvestment in Black and brown communities across the country. What this looks like on a map. What I've done here, I'm going to show you a series of slides. On the left, you're seeing it's the same base map in both cases, but on the left, you see the outlines of the neighborhoods that got the highest rankings on that 1930s era redlining map. And on the right, you're seeing neighborhoods that were redlined. And if we just put over top of that, layer on over top of that, contemporary census data on race. This is data from 2020. And so if you look over top of that, what we see today is that neighborhoods that were redlined neighborhoods that were redlined over 80 years ago are today on average in Hampton Roads 70% African American, whereas neighborhoods that escaped redlining today on average are over 70% white. You can see this represented in poverty rates. This is part of the result of this long-term disinvestment. Poverty rates in neighborhoods that were redlined are 2.5 times higher than poverty rates in neighborhoods that escaped redlining. And median home values, the driver of middle-class net worth, middle-class wealth in the US, median home values are significantly lower in neighborhoods that were redlined when compared to neighborhoods that received the highest rankings. And we can kind of see how this impact plays out economically and demographically. I also want to shift to talk about some of the environmental implications here. There's been a lot of really interesting research over the last couple of years about trees and the importance of urban tree canopy. A lot of that research actually has been done in Richmond, and I think speaks to exactly what Amy is going to be talking to us a little about later. But in Hampton Roads, as you can see on this map, neighborhoods that were redlined have a lot fewer trees and a lot higher levels of imperviousness, of a lot more pavement, more cement, more asphalt. And as a result, this was a study that was led by Dr. Jeremy Hoffman at the Science Museum of Virginia up there in Richmond, and it made it onto the front page of the New York Times. But I got this imagery and ran this analysis based on his study in the journal Climate in 2020. Neighborhoods in Hampton Roads that were redlined are on average 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit hotter on summer afternoons than neighborhoods that received this highest ranking. And if we know what populations live in formerly redlined neighborhoods, these are populations that are more likely to be renters than homeowners. They're more likely to be with high levels of poverty. They're more likely to be homes with single pane windows, with substandard insulation. This can have really profound health impacts, especially considering climate change and rising heat, and also increasing frequency and duration of heat events, of heat waves. So I think we can see very quickly how this history of discriminatory housing policy has environmental and health impacts right now in the present day. And Hampton Roads, just for broader context, is right in the middle of the pack in terms of the racialized impact of the urban heat island effect. So if we zoom out from here, let's just kind of zoom out. And I want to get at the cumulative impacts in terms of the environmental and health the cumulative impacts here. So here's the Hampton Roads region. I'll layer onto this. This is percent African American in 2020. If we highlight on here redline neighborhoods that were redlined, we can see that it's again on average about 70% African American population in these formerly redlined neighborhoods. And then let's put onto that the presence of EPA tracked toxic release inventory sites, or TRI sites. And if you run the statistics on this, and I have, if you look at it, if you just put a 1 mile buffer around each of these TRI sites, the population that lives within a mile of a TRI site in Hampton Roads is vastly disproportionately African American and high poverty. But not only that, can you all see the cursor on my screen? Let me do this. If you look in Southeast Newport News, this area of Southeast Newport News here, or if you look down to South Norfolk here, in the case of Southeast Newport News, the population that lives in these formerly redlined neighborhoods isn't just within a mile of one toxic release inventory site, it's within a mile of 29 different TRI sites. And in the case of South Norfolk, Berkeley, Compostela areas, they're within 1 mile of 20 different toxic release inventory sites. If you layer onto that the urban interstate system, I showed you before what it looked like when it was constructed. And here, again, the population within 500 meters of an urban interstate, breathing lower quality air and somewhat ironically having their personal mobility significantly impact, is again disproportionately African-American and disproportionately high poverty. Add on to that, where I mentioned the geography of public housing, you can see the public housing population is concentrated in precisely these same areas. I have a lot of other kind of health and environmental related analyses, but I want to skip to kind of the final step, and that's the impact on life expectancy. The analysis that we ran shows that across Virginia, in the 4 or 5 different cities that were redlined, for which these redlining maps exist, on average life expectancy is 7 years lower in neighborhoods that were redlined compared to neighborhoods that escaped redlining. And if you zoom in to kind of the center of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and let me just highlight one particular juxtaposition. If you look at this neighborhood here, that's kind of downtown Waterside, the Freemason district, life expectancy of the several thousand people who live in those census tracts, 6,000 or 8,000 people, life expectancy is 85 years. And if you cross St. Paul's Boulevard to the east into this redlined neighborhood that's known as St. Paul's Quadrant, life expectancy drops almost 25 years. And so this is kind of the what I think of as the long-term cumulative impacts of, like, in the present day, of this long-term history of discriminatory housing. So want to kind of move towards my conclusion, and then I see that there's already some questions in the Q&A box, and I want to make sure to give some space to Ms. Wentz as well to talk about what they're doing in Richmond. But I want to just quickly kind of move into a conclusion, and especially thinking of it in terms of urban planning and urban planning adjacent professionals. Kind of where do we go from here? And I think one thing in this, in a certain sense, when you're looking at historical documents and when you're looking at all the analyses of the impacts in the present day, like this is kind of empirically driven conclusions. This question of where do we go from here? What do we do about it? This can get into a lot more kind of, reasonable minds can disagree. So I'll state just for the record that this is my personal conclusions based on this research, based on this data, based on this empirical evidence and all these analyses. This is kind of how I frame this question of where do we go from here. And for one, we can maintain the status quo. We can choose to consciously ignore the reality that intentionally discriminatory policies and practices have created deep racial inequality that permeates all dimensions of our built urban environment. We can choose to do that. And in doing so, sorry, of course, somebody calls right in the middle. Nobody ever calls. Sorry about that. And in doing so, what we do in acting as if we're a colorblind society where we all kind of exist on a level playing field, we will continue to literally cement into our future the racially unjust landscapes that were created in our not so distant past. That's on my bad days, on my cynical days, that's what I suspect is kind of what we're most likely to do. I of course hope that does not happen, but that certainly is one, like kind of the least optimal outcome, in my opinion. If we don't want to do that, we have to work intentionally. I keep using this word intentional because the project of segregating American cities and disinvesting in Black communities, this was an intentional project. And so the project to get out of it has to be equally intentional. How can we intentionally construct more racially and socially just landscapes in the future? And so this is where I'm going to kind of switch gears because I think this is really important. We have this infrastructure law that has passed several months ago, the climate change law that passed more recently. We have cities like Norfolk are thinking about and investing millions, if not billions of dollars into climate resiliency of kind of urban futures. How can we, with this kind of opportunity, if you want to spin it that way, how can we construct more racially and socially just landscapes in the future? And so this is where I want to kind of turn the tables and not, rather than answering that question, ask kind of, I'm going to pose to you all for your consideration 3 questions that I think are really important to kind of to think about as we try to figure out how to construct more racially and socially just landscapes in the future. Question number 1 for your consideration is, how can we correct for historical and intentional devaluation of Black and brown properties and neighborhoods? And I think of these 2 slides because, and I think this is really important, as we're moving forward, property valuation plays a really important role in local decision-making processes about, for example, what neighborhoods are most worthy of being protected in the context of climate change, in the context of rising seas, and what neighborhoods is it most economical potentially to buy out for managed retreat, or to kind of to change in different ways. And how can we price in to this economic calculation the fact that Black and brown neighborhoods were made to be lower valued through a history of these intentional processes? I don't have the answer to that question. I have a sense that this is an important question to ask, but I don't have the answer to that question. But I think we do, to be kind of we need to sincerely and in good faith grapple with this question. The second question is, how can we ensure that the benefits of future development don't disproportionately flow to white communities while their burdens disproportionately impact communities of color? We are already seeing this happening. There's a recent study of Philadelphia where the more money, the more climate resiliency investments that are being made, the higher the negative change in Black and Latino populations. Basically, Black and Latino populations are being pushed away from precisely the areas where climate resiliency money and funding is being spent. I think of this a lot in terms of Norfolk's Vision 2100 and the potential impacts that it has in terms of what we're increasingly hearing about, referred to as climate gentrification. How are some of the decisions being made in terms of making Norfolk a more climate resilient city? How are these decisions going to have knock-on effects and pushing displacement of historically marginalized communities in this process of climate gentrification? One thing that I think I will point to is the work that King County in Washington, the county where Seattle is, has done to create in fact, require equity impact reviews for all kinds of infrastructure spending. And I think that's something that I really can't see a downside. If we're going to run environmental impact reviews, we ought to be thinking about equity impact reviews as well. And finally, and this is my last series of maps right here, and then I'll get off the mic and pass it around. How can we account for the cumulative socioeconomic, environmental, and health impacts of past discriminatory policies and practices? And I say this, I underlined and highlighted this word cumulative, because if you look at any one thing discretely, it doesn't tell the full story of over a century of disinvestment and devaluation that have these cumulative environmental and health impacts. So let me just give you an example here. Here's our redlined neighborhoods in Portsmouth and near downtown Norfolk. We put a layer of race onto that. We surround that with toxic release inventory sites, and we add in our interstate highways there, our urban interstate highways. We already know that these are areas with the lowest life expectancy in the city. And it's right here about a year ago that a plan was approved to move forward to build a brand new natural gas fired power station for the naval shipyard. I mean, why we're building new fossil fuel operated power stations to begin with is beyond me, but look at the location in which it was approved to be sited. I think we need to be thinking about all three of these questions. How do we deal with pricing in past discrimination? How do we make sure that the benefits don't disproportionately flow to white, middle, and upper middle class families? And how do we deal with these cumulative impacts, not just looking at things discreetly? So let me end there, and I'll just say thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions, but I do want to be respectful of all of your time, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing Amy's view from Richmond as well. So.
Great, thanks so much, Johnny. That was a fascinating presentation, pretty sobering presentation that really underscores the need to really be proactive in addressing these historic inequalities. So it's 12:39 now. I think maybe we'll just answer the questions that we have now and make sure we give Amy some time, if that works. The first question that came up, you showed the difference adjusted for median household income for Hampton Roads. Do you have the same for for a national scale? And then have you looked at adjusting for educational attainment?
Yeah, those are great questions. The data is from the census. The data is there for anyone to run the kind of the multivariate regression analyses. At the national scale, it does become complicated because the positive impact between whiteness and home values is kind of blunted by that top coding, because there are several hundred census tracts in the U.S., something like 400 or 500, where the median home value is over that 2 million mark, and they all get lowered to 2 million, even if the median home value is 10 or 12 or 15 million. They all get top coded down to 2 million, which blunts the positive impact. I haven't run so that's just kind of saying at the national impact, the data, the statistics that come out won't be quite as good. I have not run data. I have not run the analysis adjusting for educational attainment. You could for sure. The think tank Demos in 2017 published a paper called "The Asset Value of Whiteness," and in that paper they tested statistically all kinds of different things: educational attainment, single-headed households versus dual-headed households, all kinds of other things they tested statistically to see if that could, if these other things could statistically explain the racial wealth gap that we see. And what they came up with was that no, none of these other things explain the racial wealth gap. We have to look at it in terms of the long-term impact of housing discrimination.
Okay, very interesting. Let's see, another attendee has had some discussions about trees. He or she lives in a very racially diverse neighborhood. A lot of folks have been cutting down their trees. When asked why, it looks like there's some concern about hurricane storm damage with the house and also maintenance with raking leaves. So there is a perception issue as well. Do we have any data on that?
I don't know. That's a super interesting question. I think it's worthy of looking around to see if there's anything been published on that. I don't know of it offhand, but I would be really, I would read that paper if I could find it. I don't have an answer though, so sorry.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'd be interested in that as well. And perhaps on some level, there's some thinking about siting and the kind of trees you're using, maybe smaller size to prevent some serious damage. But yeah, that would be an interesting question. Let's see. Is past housing policy the key driver of the differences in lifespan, or are there other factors such as poverty and poor healthcare that are more important?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. Thanks for that. And so I think discriminatory housing policies, poverty, and poor healthcare are kind of all intersectionally related. But what the public health literature indicates is that kind of what they broadly refer to as the social determinants of health, which have to do with housing, with mobility, with education, with poverty, with all these social factors, are far more important to get taken together, are far more important in kind of impacting longevity and health in general than, for example, medical treatment and medical care. So I don't want to overstate here that line between housing policy, discriminatory housing policies in the past, and differences in life expectancy in the present, because there's a lot else that's there: poverty, education, all these, the access to full service grocery stores, and this literature on food deserts, for example. All of it also kind of cumulatively creates that difference in life expectancy. But housing and housing policy kind of runs through this racialized poverty that we see in a lot of areas is at least partially caused by the legacy of discriminatory housing. The lack of home ownership in some communities, again, relates back to that. The lack of healthcare, pharmacies, clinics, urgent care centers, hospitals being sited in low-income, primarily minority neighborhoods is again related back to the past of discriminatory housing. So I think it's hard to disentangle all of these kind of intersecting forces, but I would kind of talk about them broadly together in the context of the social determinants of health.
Okay, got it. And then last question, point being is that there could be different cultural attitudes with regard to what is a more valuable property. Is there survey data on what people feel is most valuable in a property?
Is this referring to the question above with trees? I think it's probably in reference back up to the one about trees and cutting down trees because of storm damage. And again, I don't have a lot to say about that, other than I would be super interested to see if it's been written about, and if it hasn't been written about, it would be a really, I think, important area for study, especially thinking in terms of kind of where we go from here. But I also think, I suspect that Amy will have more insights from her work on these questions of kind of cultural perceptions of the importance and the value of trees and shade than I do from my vantage. So maybe that's a good segue, and I can pass the mic.
Yeah, that's an excellent segue. And thank you again, Dr. Finn. That was a fascinating presentation. So now that we've got about 15 minutes left, let me introduce Amy Wentz, the co-founder of Southside Releaf. Amy is a United States Army veteran. She's a proud mother of two who serves in her community advocating to improve the public education system, working to promote safe and healthy neighborhoods, and striving to achieve equitable outcomes for the residents throughout the city of Richmond. She is the founder of Positively Black Richmond, co-founder of Richmond Black Restaurant Experience, and is on the action team for Black RVA, all with goals of uplifting Black faces and spaces throughout the city. In addition, Amy serves on boards for No Left Turns, Stay RVA, Unbound RVA, and the Alternatives to Incarceration and Richmond Children's Cabinet Commissions here in the city of Richmond. She's received numerous accolades over the years for her continued service in the community. She was recognized as one of Style Weekly's top 40 under 40 in 2013 and honored with a Community Service Award from Richmond City Council for her extensive volunteerism in the 8th District. She currently works full-time as an analyst for a software development company and is a proud graduate of Richmond Public Schools. It's a very busy schedule, so thank you again, Amy, for taking the time to meet with us. We sure do appreciate it. And I'll pass it to you now.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. I need to change my bio. I actually work now for the Commonwealth Institute, which is a policy shop here in Richmond, and I'm the director of outreach and engagement there. So, but thank you so much for that. I just wanted to kind of start off. I have a presentation I'm going to kind of zip through because I know we're tough on time, but I just want to talk a little bit about just how we started Southside Releaf, because I think it kind of paints a picture and kind of coincides with what Dr. Johnny talked about. We were working, Cherie and I were working on the Richmond 300 master planning process for the city of Richmond. We were both on community engagement working groups. So they had community members that kind of showed up for working groups. I was on economic development, she was on environmental, and we all received what was called an insights report. And that was a report with like all of this data, statistics, and all this information about housing, transportation, environmental concerns, zoning. It had all these things in there about Richmond and the districts. And one of the things that stuck out to us was that there was an up to 20-year life expectancy differences from where we live and parts in other areas in Richmond north of the river. And so at the time, I think my daughter was 19 years old. And I remember saying to myself, like, wow, like her whole span of life, you know, could just potentially not be there for someone based on where they live in Richmond. And so we were like, starting to kind of unpack that, talk about why that is. A lot of the information that Dr. Johnny shared was, you know, the information that we received and were studying. We also sat down with Jeremy Hoffman at the Science Museum, talked about, we worked with him to do some heat sensors around the city and found that there was up to 16% difference between, on a hot day, the temperature in areas that we lived in and areas over here in Southside than other areas in north of the river. So we created Southside Releaf. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that we're doing, because hope is not lost, everyone. And so I'm going to kind of bring a little bit of the hope in. Let's see. Let me know if everybody can see that. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yep, looks great.
All right. Community through lines, strengthening engagement through green spaces. And so the first couple of pictures are just talking about a tale of two cities. You know, we like to start off with this image just because how dope is it when spaces are inviting and culturally inclusive. This right here is an area of South Side and an area of North Side, just talking about like showing this the streetscape and how you know, much of what Dr. Johnny was talking about is very much relevant in South Side. You can go into certain areas and see the difference, see the disinvestment. Just like he said, talking about redlining and urban renewal, every Black neighborhood, regardless of income level, was outlined in red and classified as hazardous for housing loans and insurance. And then by 1960, an estimated 958 families had been displaced by urban renewal projects in Richmond. And so you had redlining that happened, yes, and that sucked. But then you also had urban renewal, which is like, we're going to make things better. We're going to, you know, put up these stadiums and we're going to, you know, redo downtown. We're going to, you know, scrape out old neighborhoods like Jackson Ward and Navy Hill that primarily a lot of Black people lived in. And we're going to, you know, bring in the highways, and that caused a lot of displacement. In Southside specifically, they turned it into like a warehousing district, warehouses, and a lot of, we have a lot of industrial type of things that are over here, which caused a lot of pavement, a lot of hot areas that, you know, that make Southside a little bit harder. It's also been referred to as a culture of clearance. This is just talking about the block is hot. Richmond is number 8 in the country for the highest asthma-related emergency room visits. We're actually 3rd in the country for asthma in general. We see an increase in heat-related emergency visits, and we also have the 2nd highest eviction rates in the country. And so showing that parallel between, and a lot of that is happening in the same red line areas. If you put the urban heat island map over top of the redlining map, you see the similarities, and you can even put the eviction rate map over it, the gun violence rate, the gun violence map over it. Like it trickles down into so many intersections of, you know, of challenges for our city. This is just some pictures of, you know, it seems like when flooding happens in Richmond, in certain areas, it gets highlighted on the news, but there are certain parts of Southside and this street particularly, that no matter what type of rain, how much rain, it ends up looking like this. And it's like that for days, which brings a lot of other issues, like, you know, neighborhoods aren't walkable and bikeable. You have pests and mosquitoes and other, you know, things like that, that, you know, challenges that this brings. Same thing with our, you know, tree wells and street trees. And there was a lot of planning that happened in neighborhoods north of the river. If you've been in, you know, Windsor Farms and in the Fan, and over there off of Monument Avenue, like Patterson and Grove, they have beautiful trees that line their streets. You can take, I did an interview with CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, one day, and I brought them out on a really hot day, and I simulated getting off of work at a warehouse off of Richmond Highway, formerly Jefferson Davis Highway, getting off of work and walking down the street to the bus stop that has no shelter. There's no trees that line the street. And we walked from the warehouse to the bus stop. And by the time we got there, we were all like dripping in sweat. And then we took them north of the river, and we did the same thing, simulated getting off of work, walking to the bus stop. And it was so much more pleasant, so much cooler, because the trees were, you know, outlining the streets. And so just showing that comparison. And I think this is probably the bus stop off of Richmond Highway that we had traveled to in this picture here. All right, ongoing crisis. The East End and South Richmond experience high rates of poverty, evictions, chronic illnesses, and community violence. This ultimately leads to what I was telling you about, an up to 20-year shorter lifespan compared to West End residents. And if you look at this, this was the actual snippet of the insights report that both of us watched and looked at before we created Southside Releaf. Of course, racism plus white supremacy equals a man-made disaster. Like Dr. Johnny said, it was very intentional. And we make sure that when we are working with community members, that they know that certain things are not just accidentally happening to them. Things are not just accidentally harder for them. That this was very much intentional. It's going to take intentional work to fix it. A quote here from Michael Paul Williams, if you're familiar with him, Pulitzer Prize winner from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, that has highlighted a lot of our work. Richmond must stop waging war with the past and fight for its future. We've got to leave the lies behind. If we want to keep bending towards justice, we've got to keep our eye on the prize. So we've coined the new term. The new term is greenlining. Greenlining is the practice of increasing investment in neighborhoods which have been redlined or otherwise disadvantaged to expand economic opportunities. They should be used to create pathways for opportunity for our communities. I think it's important to address and talk about, unfortunately, what happens when you attempt to give neighborhoods and attempt to work with neighbors to fight for things that they should have already had to begin with. Unfortunately, because of greed and because of greedy folks, it's really tough. It's challenging for us, because as we work to bring in new parks, we convinced the city to bring on 5 new park spaces in South Richmond because we don't have as many access to green spaces. Part of the Richmond 300 plan was that every resident of Richmond should have a green space, a public park to go to within a 10-minute walk or 2-mile radius of their house. And that was impossible in much of Southside. And so we're working to bring on parks. One of the new parks is along the Broad Rock Creek. It used to be Stony Bridge Apartments over off of Commerce. And what we noticed is as soon as we started making plans for the park, the investor bought up the property next door and started, to work on a development that is gonna, essentially is pricing out the people who have historically lived in that community. Unfortunately, it's a challenge for us because while we're trying to ensure that folks are getting the things that they've been deserving, that they're also able to stay there and afford to live there. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we do, and then how we're trying to overcome those challenges. So of course, we do tree plantings and maintain green spaces. There's a tree score equity card that came out from American Forest that has data on trees and areas, and they score it by equity and race, poverty levels, students that are attending Title I schools. They have all of these measures in this scorecard, and we're able to look at zip codes and look at certain areas and kind of target them for tree plantings and tree giveaways. We just had one at Southside Community Center this weekend where we gave away 250 trees, but we target specific zip codes and specific areas to encourage trees. We also working on, reducing pollution, of course, developing the technical skills of residents. We have a greening working group made up of Southside residents where each month we learn about a new topic related to climate change. And so it could be about urban heat islands, it could be about urban forestry, it could be about green infrastructure. We take them through a series of, trainings so that we can kind of build up our brain trust within just our neighborhoods, so that we're able to understand why it's important that we fight for these things. Because in the neighborhoods that we service, of course, it's easier to focus on like the right now, what's right in front of you, right? So we know that gun violence is prevalent in the city of Richmond. We know that we have a housing crisis. We know that there's transportation issues, and the transportation routes are not as equitable on the South Side. It takes longer to get places. So we have a lot of things that we have to fight for, right? And so it's easy to kind of push climate change and greening efforts to the left, but we're educating the community because we know that we have to do what we can now for our children and our children's children. And so we make sure that that is that importance of that is known. Educating our neighbors, like I said, we do trainings. We also sponsor classes for people to take trainings with other, like the tree stewards. It's a pretty expensive course, I think about $300. If you're a Southside resident, we pay for people to attend that. Using data and community-driven processes for planning. We do center community voice. It's very important that people with lived experience and that can share that lived experience are the driving force behind what we do. And so that's super huge. And then passing the mic so that our neighbors can use their own voice and advocate for change. I think that a lot of times, groups and leaders, come and speak for a community. And it's important to us that we're doing power shifting, and we're making sure that we're shifting power into the people, back to the people, which it should have never left them to begin with. So these are just some questions. I do this training for a lot of, like a training or presentation for a lot of different groups, but a lot of times I'm trying to help educate them on how to advocate in their or work with communities for advocacy. So we can skip through that, but yeah, we're working on trust building. We're working on relationship building with our communities. I am a Southside resident, been here, graduated from Richmond Public Schools, Huguenot High School. Cherie is from the area. She chose to move here. When she left, she was working overseas, came back and chose here. So we are very much committed to ensuring that Southside remains relevant in the conversation when a lot of times that we're overlooked, and relevant in the budget as well. Let's see. Uh, Important questions to ask. So these are things that we always just kind of leave, similar to Dr. Johnny. How are we addressing housing, education, healthcare, economic security, and transportation in our work? Talking about greening groups, right? So a lot of times we go into greening conversations with environmental organizations, the big ones, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, like huge organizations. And a lot of times Sheree and I are the only people of color in the room. We have weekly and monthly arborist and urban forestry meetings with the city. We're the only people of color on those calls. So it's like really important for us to push back on the organizations and make sure that they are you know, are your materials in Spanish? Are you being intentional with the way that you reach out into the community? Let's see, where can we collaborate with partner groups to increase access to green spaces, jobs, and civic engagement? So one of the things that I will say that I applaud some of the bigger organizations is they're going beyond the bay, moving into the watershed, which are directly in the creeks and waterways that are right in our neighborhoods. And so they're being very intentional about partnering with organizations such as ours at Southside Releaf to ensure that that all of those big dollars that they're getting for greening, you know, are filtering into our communities. And like I said, pushing them also to ensure that not just showing up for a tree planting or a tree giveaway, but also in the halls of power when it's time for us to put in ordinances that ensure that development projects are complete with, you know, trees, and they have a tree ordinance that they have to follow to ensure that that they're building up a structure in the way that it should be built up. Also working in, you know, we want these greening groups and these environmental groups to also be fighting with us on making sure that housing is affordable, and that that we're changing our structure and how we tax folks so that people who have been committed to neighborhoods that had this done to them can stay there. And so the last one is, how is our work trauma informed, and does it focus on social resilience in addition to climate resilience? I mean, I think that in this fight, you know, especially doing racial equity and racial justice work, it is you know, it's hard. It's tough to show up in rooms all the time and always putting on your war paint and always getting ready to fight. So we're always making sure that restorative practices and mindfulness, and that we are making sure that our community can withstand the advocacy and the fight that we have. Talking about partnerships, real results. Like I said, we're working with Jeremy Hoffman at the Science Museum. He did that phenomenal research on urban heat islands. And now we've created this dope game. If y'all want to come to it, I think it's in October, but I can put you on the list. But we've created this dope game, which community members can come and they learn about climate change and what's happening in Richmond, but they also hear from community voices about their experiences with specific things. And so they have different approaches that you can pick from, and you have to kind of strategize with your team on which approach you're going to take. You only get a certain amount of money, so you have to kind of prioritize where you're going to put your money. But anyways, that's coming up in October. Another way to engage the community. All the materials are in Spanish. We're inviting Spanish, our Latino communities as well. And like I said, with Chesapeake Bay, some of these other big groups, we're able to kind of bring them out of the tower and bring them into the community and really see what it's like out here. Let's see. These are just some community events that we did. Swansboro Playground, Hickory Hill Community Center, Branches Baptist Church, where we were able to take up a huge chunk of pavement out of the church parking lot and turn it into a community green space. Same with Second Baptist Church, digging up part of the parking lot, turning it into a community farm, and now they have a farmer's market that runs out of there. And some other pictures. Blackwell Elementary School. They have a beautiful playground that has absolutely no shade, so did some tree planting around there. Let me see, what time is it? Oh, 1:04, it's over. So yeah, I mean, anything else you need to know or want to know, please reach out to us. Here's our information here. But we love doing this work. It's very important work. We take it very seriously. We are part-time volunteers, so Sheree and I both have full-time jobs, but this is our nonprofit that we run on weekends and at nights and late in the midnight hour. But we'd love to have volunteers. We definitely are looking for a volunteer coordinator, projects, some project management, and we're getting some funding to try to open up those positions. So if you know anybody, please connect us. And I appreciate you all's time. If you have any questions, just let me know.
Great, thanks so much, Jamie. That was another wonderful presentation. It was nice to end on a hopeful note, as you mentioned. It's great to see the kind of work your organization is doing. And one thing you mentioned that really kind of resonated with me was talking about building trust in the community. And I feel like that's really where it becomes so important to have these community-based organizations, because for good reason. I think there's a lot of skepticism for underserved communities when governments, localities come in and start talking about projects. We've been burned in the past. I think there's a healthy skepticism there. So working with the community, trusted individuals, that really is absolutely critical to have successful projects. I think Jillian mentioned there might have been a question. I don't know if
I don't see the attendee raising their hand any longer, but if it is okay with all of the panelists, I will be sharing the emails of you both in our follow-up email to all attendees if they have any further questions that they were not able to ask today. And again, all of the links that I've placed in the chat from Dr. Finn's presentation and Amy's presentation as well will be included in the follow-up email.
Great. Well, thank you both again so much. I think we all really learned a lot. Really do appreciate it. And thanks for the folks for staying on. I know we're running a little bit late here, so appreciate everyone staying on. We'll be back in October with another resiliency webinar series. So stay tuned for updates about that. I'll get with Elizabeth from the Virginia Coastal Policy Clinic, and we'll start working on that roster. But again, thanks again, and thanks so much to our panelists here. Really, really fascinating stuff. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Amy.
Take care.